All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking some seriously heavy source material into these deeply personal, systemic allegations of abuse within trusted therapeutic circles. The text essentially outlines a chilling scenario where the exact spaces built for recovery and enlightenment are allegedly, weaponized into traps. Since we're dealing with some complex psychological mechanics today, here is our roadmap. We're going to cover the illusion of healing, parasitic thought forms, weaponizing music and consent, medicine is poison, and finally, the void of accountability. Okay, kicking things off with Section 1, the illusion of healing. We need to look at the stark contrast between sacred intentions and some very dark realities. So, on paper, the intended purpose of these groups is exactly what you'd expect: spiritual growth, community, healing. But the transcripts allege a vastly different, weaponized reality of coercion, control, and trauma. The speaker claims that specific spaces in Vancouver and Victoria, places practically designed for vulnerability, are allegedly transformed into environments of grooming and trafficking. What is supposed to be this beautiful sanctuary is described instead as a highly dysfunctional ecosystem that actively preys on open individuals. Now, the text gives us this massive reframing of personal trauma. The speaker outright says it's not a couple breaking down, it's organized crime. Think about that for a second. The allegation here is that beneath the surface of a supportive therapist community lies an ecosystem functioning basically like a criminal enterprise. The speaker is insisting that his family's crisis wasn't just a relationship dissolving under stress. He characterizes it as a systemic, organized attack by bad actors using the facade of healing as a front for psychological abuse. Moving right along to Section 2, parasitic thought forms and how these ideologies siphon energy. The source transcripts use this incredibly visceral term, parasitic thought forms. The discussions reveal how these bad actors adopt the language of spiritual elders to literally drain individuals, operating as psychological parasites. The text even compares it to a germ theory of trauma, where a whole spiritual community becomes overwhelmed with illness. Essentially, these parasitic ideas masquerade as legitimate spiritual wisdom. Why? To bypass a person's critical thinking so that their creative and life force energy can be siphoned away. It's a really stark warning about how easily our critical thinking can be short-circuited when we're desperate for guidance. So how exactly does this extraction happen? Well, step 1 is targeting individuals with what one speaker calls leaky energy or porous boundaries. We're talking about people who are going through a crisis or who are just highly empathetic and open. Step 2, the bad actor presents themselves as a trusted spiritual elder. And then, step 3, they siphon the individual's personal agency under the guise of collective healing. This step-by-step extraction completely relies on exploiting someone's emotional openness, ultimately disempowering them while dangling the promise of a spiritual awakening. All right, Section 3, weaponizing music and consent, and the illusion of agreement. We usually think of coercion as physical or overtly threatening, right? But the source describes this chilling inversion of consent. The text outlines how an individual named Misha allegedly used a public musical performance to inflict psychological sadism on a partner named Emily. The steps are so deliberate. First, create a false sense of safety at a retreat. Second, ask for quasi-consent in front of a group, making it socially impossible to say no. Third, use a sensory tool, in this case just singing a song, to inflict deep psychological harm and actively undermine a private relationship. It is incredibly insidious. The speaker in the transcript recounts feeling in absolute shock as this unfolded. He notes that while he nominally agreed to let the song be played, he absolutely never consented to the psychological manipulation and public performance that followed. The source frames this as an act of extreme sadism, a total breach of genuine consent that uses the unifying, beautiful power of music as a literal weapon. This brings us to Section 4, medicine as poison, where we see the inversion of sacred tools. This is where the allegations get even darker. The transcript alleges a criminal misuse of plant medicine. Instead of facilitating a sacred healing experience, the medicine was allegedly used as an avenue to drug, groom, and traffic individuals. In these unregulated ceremonies, substances intended as medicine are allegedly used as a poison for extreme sadism. The speaker recounts a horrifying event where his partner returned from a retreat, completely drugged and violated, completely stripping away the sacred nature of the practice. And the notes make it clear that this isn't just one bad apple. As the text states, a lot of the teachers, healers, gurus are actually abusing their power. The other speaker in the transcript jumps in to agree, noting she has heavily researched these spaces and recognized that these parasitic behaviors are widespread. It highlights this incredibly dangerous environment where people elevated to the status of guru or healer systematically exploit the inherent power imbalance. Finally, Section 5, the void of accountability. What happens when the system completely fails? The sources lay out what is basically a catastrophic failure of accountability across the board. First, these communities operate entirely without institutional guardrails. Second, there is a total lack of legal recourse for the victims. Third, there is a complicit network of enablers, people who just look the other way or actively protect the abusers. And finally, the source claims that government and police institutions completely ignore the abuse, leaving victims completely stranded. 200. Stop and think about that number for a second. That is the number of lawyers the source claims to have contacted without finding representation. He describes cementing his status as a legal outlaw, totally unable to find justice. The speaker talks about being subjected to unlawful proceedings, forced into self-representation, and entirely ostracized by the legal community in Canada. This number, 200, serves as a staggering metric of systemic exclusion. It just goes to show how nearly impossible it is to penetrate legal formalism when you're dealing with unconventional psychological forms of abuse. There's this massive, tragic gap between what we expect the system to do and the reality victims actually face. We expect justice to look like police intervention and legal protection, of course, but the systemic reality, according to the text, is total ostracization. The speaker argues that the court system completely lacks the sophistication to recognize psychological trauma and organized abuse when it's disguised as spiritual practice. So the victim is left entirely isolated, while the perpetrators allegedly face zero consequences. So we're leaving you with this vital question to chew on today, especially given the urgent need for accountability in spaces built purely on trust. When healing communities operate without guardrails, who protects the vulnerable from the healers? Because based on the source material we unpacked today, the terrifying answer might just be no one.